Now, as we usher into a new week of firearms inspection and troubleshooting, we'll start talking about different types of firearms. And this week we'll move on to revolvers. And we'll get into the different types of revolvers and some inspection techniques and things of that nature. But first and foremost, we always have to make sure that we have the right tools. And just like last week, we're going to have a different focus every week. And this focus will concentrate on bench blocks and things that we can use to assist us in completing our tasks a lot more effectively and efficiently. Now, as we flip this one over, we can see that if you work on 1911s, this might be your best friend. Sometimes you need a third hand, right? Now, there's another type of assistance that we can use when we have the AR-15 platforms. So just make sure that you always have the right tools. All right. Now, as we get into the revolvers, let's first start off with the most simplest, in my opinion, would be the most simplest are the single action revolvers. Now, here we have a Smith & Wesson Victory 22 long rifle single action revolver, very popular revolver. In order to make sure that it is clear with no live ammunition present and no ammunition inside of that firearm, you will have to open that loading gate. Now, once you open that loading gate on your single action revolvers, you will be able to then manually cycle through to ensure that there is no live ammunition inside of that revolver. Now, the way that you remove the cylinder from most modern single action revolvers is going to differ. So you are going to want to make sure that you have an owner's manual handy if you are not familiar with how to do so. You also want to check all the other functions, so you can use a snap cap to ensure that it will load and seat properly, and you want to check all of those chambers in the cylinder. You also want to close it up and make sure that it does index well. Now, you also want to take the time to make sure that the trigger assembly and the hammer functions properly, and this may take several attempts, so make sure that you're thorough during this portion of the inspection and troubleshooting procedures. When the hammer is in the resting position, as you can see, the trigger should not actuate. You should not be able to break a shot if the hammer is in the resting position. Remember, this is a single action revolver. Pressing the trigger will only do one function, and that is releasing that hammer. And now you can proceed to completing the rest of your function checks. Be sure to check that ejector rod spring tension, guys. Single action revolvers are favorites of many shooters. So you may come in contact with them and you may have to get your hands dirty and work on some of these good old guns. Now, some important takeaways. As always, we want to make sure that there is no live ammunition present in the workspace. Remember that math equation. If you eliminate one of the variables, the math equation does not hold true, meaning that firearm cannot discharge. Make sure you eliminate one of those variables, that variable being ammunition. Also remember, single action revolvers may seem simple in how they operate, but there are several functions that you have to check. And like always, guys, remember the owner's manual will be your friend. The owner's manual will be your friend because you will never, ever see every single firearm. So at some point, you may have to learn something special about a specific model. So just understand that you will have to do some special checks. Different models open in different conditions. That means that some single action revolvers, you may have to have it in half cock before that loading gate will open. Some, like the one you saw in the video, you won't. So again, make sure you check your owner's manual. Also, checking that owner's manual will ensure that you understand how to be safe with that firearm. That's going to be very important. Always be safe, guys. This next point. Even with revolvers, just like semi-automatic pistols, rifles, shotguns, whatever the case may be, make sure that your fingers do not enter that trigger guard until the firearm is A, pointed in the safe direction, and B, you are ready to dry fire test. This is if you are not at the range. Remember, you may have to go to the range to conduct some live fire safety checks, live fire inspections before you give these firearms back to their owners. All right, so let's remember that. And lastly, but definitely not least, always ensure that there is no live ammunition present in that workspace. Remember, we're training our minds, guys. Now, as we move on to double action revolvers, remember, guys, there will be some differences from those single action revolvers, especially in how the cylinder operates. And your double action revolvers, your cylinder will most definitely be able to eject from the frame, usually on that crane. But in order to be safe, you always want to make sure that those cylinders are empty. You also want to check the bore to ensure that there's nothing stuck in or protruding inside of that bore, just to be safe. Remember that, guys. And I would also turn it upside down just to see if anything can shake out by way of gravity. Again, we're just wanting to make sure that we're safe. The beauty in these double action revolvers and any type of revolver in which the cylinder is able to swing out from the frame is that you can easily check each chamber in that cylinder. And now you can proceed to conduct the rest of your function check. But just like with your single action revolvers, guys, make sure you're checking that spring tension of your ejector rod. It should be very positive, and you should be able to feel that tension as you press down on it. Also, you want to make sure that that cylinder index is correctly inside of that frame. So make sure once you close it up, it indexes correctly. Now, as we close out this lesson on revolvers, I do want to leave you guys with a couple of more important takeaways. But this time, these takeaways are more geared towards these double action revolvers, okay? First and foremost, you always want to ensure that there is no live ammunition present in your workspace. All right, guys. Remove it from your workspace. Remember, we want to have a workspace that's dedicated to work. So that place should never, ever, ever even see ammunition. Have your ammunition and loading equipment and all that other stuff in another place. All right. Now, double action revolver should always be handled with the cylinder in the open position, unless we are either dry fire practice, testing, or we are engaged in live fire scenario. Okay. But while we are not, that cylinder should be open, that firearm should be empty, and those firearms should be handled with that cylinder open. And one good point, and not many people ever talk about this point, but one very, very, very good point is that we should never, ever, ever cowboy close, and I'm using air quotes here, but we should never, ever, ever cowboy close revolvers. And we've all seen those old Western movies where the guy loads that revolver cylinder and he gives it a good spin and then he slams it into the closed position. Well, if you take a look at any revolver as that cylinder is open, there's a small detent in the back of that cylinder well. Now, when you what we call cowboy close those revolvers, you most definitely eventually will do some damage to that little detent. And that damage is very, very, very important for indexing the cylinders as you fire the revolver. So we should never, ever, ever, what I call cowboy close our revolvers. All right. Now, as we close this lesson and begin to start our discussion, again, I want to leave you guys with something just to think about. Okay. Now, when we're talking about revolvers, are revolvers in any way or in your opinion any better or worse than your semi-automatic handguns? You know, a lot of people say, well, capacity, or a lot of people say that revolvers are better because of ease of operation. But what's your opinion? What do you think about this debate amongst revolvers versus semi-automatic handguns? Let's have a good week, guys. Hey, let's get to work.